Welcome back to the Bookshelf Odyssey. My name is Art. I'm wanting to start a series that I'm calling Victorian Shorts. No, not those. No. As in Victorian short stories. Last month for Victober, I read a Dickens short story, The Signalman, and that was a lot of fun to read. And several of you said you really enjoyed that. So I wanted to do something about once a month or so where I introduce to you one of my favorite Victorian short stories and read them to you and then talk a little bit about it after the story. And so that's what I'm going to be doing today. And I'm hoping that they will be out on every third Wednesday of the month. I'm not sure about next month because of Christmas. Things get a little crazy. For sure, starting in January, you can expect that every third Wednesday, I'll have a Victorian short story that I'll read to you. Reading aloud is one of my favorite activities and part of the reason why I started a podcast, whether it's my Christmas podcast or even this channel. I just wanted to have opportunities to not just introduce some classic works, but to read them as well. I used to read aloud to my kids for many years, and that was always a lot of fun. We had some fun with the voices and talking about where the story could go, different things like that. And so now that they're older and I don't know, they think it's kind of weird to be in their teens and still have dad read them a bedtime story, I guess, beats me. In any case, I'll be reading a story to you today. Now, the reason I'm choosing Victorian stories is because that's my favorite time period of literature. And there are Plus, they also have the benefit of being in the public domain, so I don't have to pay any royalties for them. So bonus both ways. But I'm really excited about today's story. As I mentioned, last month I read to you one of Charles Dickens's last short stories, The Signalman. Today I wanted to read to you his very first short story, and it's called A Dinner at Poplar Walk. It's hard to imagine Charles Dickens doing anything other than being an author, but as a young man, he did work for a newspaper, and I think he was even a theater critic for a short time. And at one point, he went to go try out to be an actor for this local theater. The day that he was going to go and audition, he woke up with a cold and wasn't able to make it. And he wrote a letter to the theater manager and said, I'm going to have to try again next year because I guess every year, maybe in the spring or something, they would have auditions for that coming year. So, and in that time, he ended up getting published as a fiction writer. And well, as they say, the rest is history. And of course, throughout his life, Dickens loved the theater. He loved acting. And he very much popularized the idea of doing a one-man show, especially of his own work, which was a bit controversial at the time. But he loved doing the readings. He loved connecting with his audience and had such a great love for his reading public, especially if they loved him in return. It's possible it might have been a little bit of an ego boost for him, but I can't say I blame him either. And I want to read to you Dickens's account of how he had his very first story published before we actually even get to the story. I'm reading from a book called My Early Times, and it's edited by Peter Rowland. And it's a collection of biographical sketches and letters and things, kind of forming a autobiography of Dickens's early life up until right around the time he wrote Nicholas Nickleby. It covers that period of his life. I read this book for Victober and really enjoyed it. Some I had read before, some parts of it I hadn't. And he's talking about all the ways that he had come out as a young man, as a journalist, as a theater critic. And then he says this about his very first published story. He said, "I had also come out in another way. I had taken, with fear and trembling, to authorship. I wrote a little story in secret entitled A Sunday Out of Town, which I dropped stealthily one evening at twilight into a dark letter box in a dark office up a dark court in Fleet Street. It appeared in all the glory of print in the December 1833 issue of the monthly magazine. Its name transmogrified to A Dinner at Poplar Walk. on which occasion, how well I remember it, I walked down to Westminster Hall and turned into it for half an hour because my eyes were so dimmed with joy and pride that they could not bear the street and were not fit to be seen there. It says, thereafter, albeit for next to nothing, I took heart to write a good many trifling pieces. Some appeared in the monthly magazine, some in the Morning Chronicle, and early in 1836, a series of these were collected and published in 2 volumes, illustrated by my esteemed friend, Mr. George Cruikshank. It must be emphasized that these sketches were written and published one by one when I was still a very young man. They were collected and republished while I was still a very young man and sent into the world with all their imperfections, a good many, on their heads. They comprised my first attempts at authorship, with the exception of those tragedies already referred to, achieved at the mature age of 8 or 10, and represented with great applause to overflowing nurseries. I am conscious now of their often being extremely crude and ill-considered, and bearing obvious marks of haste and inexperience, but they were very leniently and favorably received on their first appearance. So the very first story he wrote, A Dinner at Poplar Walk, and it would have said it was published by Boz or Bose, depending on your accent, I guess. And I love his reminiscing of the time he finally saw his first story in print. You know, a little bit of perhaps authorial outrage that, oh, they changed my title, but it was so perfect, you know. But then just the excitement of being published overcame any of that. And I like how he would walk past where the papers were being sold and had to kind of just walk to collect his thoughts to get himself under control emotionally. What's funny is that of the many authors I've talked to, I think they would all say that they've had similar experiences with their very first published story, that it's almost indescribable. I can't believe this actually happened. Here's my book or my story in print. It has my name on it. This is incredible. So it's fun to see that Dickens was really, in some ways, like all of us when we see that goal reached. It's interesting that the story was published in December. Dickens has become so connected to Christmas, though this is not a Christmas story. Although it could be set at Christmas, I suppose. It doesn't really give mention to the season. And it tells the story of Mr. Minns, and he's a bit of a grump. And as the story says, he doesn't like children and he doesn't like dogs. But then one day his cousin comes to visit him, who happens to have a dog and also happens to have a young child, and he invites him to dinner because he wants him to be his child's godfather. So as I read you the story, I invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy A Dinner at Poplar Walk by Charles Dickens. A Dinner at Poplar Walk by Charles Dickens. Mr. Augustus Minns was a bachelor, of about 40, as he said, of about 48, as his friends said. He was always exceedingly clean, precise, and tidy, perhaps somewhat priggish, and the most retiring man in the world. He usually wore a brown frock coat without a wrinkle, light inexplicables without a spot, a neat neckerchief with a remarkably neat tie, and boots without a fault. Moreover, he always carried a brown silk umbrella with an ivory handle. He was a clerk in Somerset House, or, as he said himself, he held a responsible situation under government. He had a good and increasing salary, in addition to some £10,000 of his own, invested in the funds, and he occupied a first floor in Tavistock Street, Covent Garden, where he had resided for 20 years, having been in the habit of quarrelling with his landlord the whole time, regularly giving notice of his intention to quit on the first day of every quarter, and as regularly countermanding it on the second. There were 2 classes of created objects which he held in the deepest and most unmingled horror. These were dogs and children. He was not unamiable, but he could at any time have viewed the execution of a dog or the assassination of an infant with the liveliest satisfaction. Their habits were at variance with his love of order, and his love of order was as powerful as his love of life. Mr. Augustus Minns had no relations in or near London, with the exception of his cousin, Mr. Octavius Budden, to whose son, whom he had never seen, for he disliked the father, he had consented to become godfather by proxy. Mr. Budden, having realized a moderate fortune by exercising the trade or calling of a corn chandler, and having a great predilection for the country, had purchased a cottage in the vicinity of Stamford Hill, whither he retired with the wife of his bosom and his only son, Master Alexander Augustus Budden. One evening, as Mr. and Mrs. B. were admiring their son, discussing his various merits, talking over his education, and disputing whether the classics should be made an essential part thereof, the lady pressed so strongly upon her husband the propriety of cultivating the friendship of Mr. Minns in behalf of their son, that Mr. Budden should at last made up his mind that it should not be his fault if he and his cousin were not in future more intimate. "I'll break the ice, my love," said Mr. Budden, stirring up the sugar at the bottom of his glass of brandy and water, and casting a sidelong look at his spouse to see the effect of the announcement of his determination, "by asking Minns down to dine with us on Sunday." "Then pray, Budden, write to your cousin at once," replied Mrs. Budden. "Who knows if we could only get him down here, but he might take a fancy to our Alexander and leave him as property? Alec, my dear, take your legs off the rail of the chair." "Very true," said Mr. Budden, musing. "Very true indeed, my love." On the following morning, as Mr. Minns was sitting at his breakfast table, alternately biting his dry toast and casting a look upon the columns of his morning paper, which he always read from the title to the printer's name, he heard a loud knock at the street door, which was shortly afterwards followed by the entrance of his servant, who put into his hands a particularly small card on which was engraved in immense letters, "Mr. Octavius Budden, Amelia Cottage," Mrs. B.'s name was Amelia, "Poplar Walk, Stamford Hill." "Budden!" ejaculated Minns. "What can bring that vulgar man here? Say I'm asleep, say I'm out, and shall never be home again. Anything to keep him downstairs." "But please, sir, the gentleman's coming up," replied the servant, and the fact was made evident by an appalling creaking of boots on the staircase, accompanied by a pattering noise, the cause of which Minns could not, for the life of him, divine. "Show the gentleman in," said the unfortunate bachelor. Exit servant and enter Octavius, preceded by a large white dog, dressed in a suit of fleecy hosiery, with pink eyes, large ears, and no perceptible tail. The cause of the pattering on the stairs was but too plain. Mr. Augustus Minns staggered beneath the shock of the dog's appearance. "My dear fellow, how are you?" said Budden as he entered. He always spoke at the top of his voice, and always said the same thing half a dozen times. "How are you, my hearty?" How do you do, Mr. Budden? Pray, take a chair," politely stammered the discomfited Minns. Thank you. Well, how are you, eh?" "Uncommonly well, thank you," said Minns, casting a diabolical look at the dog, who, with his hind legs on the floor and his forepaws resting on the table, was dragging a bit of bread and butter out of a plate, preparatory to devouring it with the buttered side next the carpet. "Oh, you rogue," said Budden to his dog. "You see, Minns, he's like me, always at home, eh, my boy? Egad, I'm precious hot and hungry. I've walked all the way from Stamford Hill this morning." "Have you breakfasted?" inquired Minns. "Oh, no. Came to breakfast with you. So ring the bell, my dear fellow, will you? And let's have another cup and saucer and the cold ham. Make myself at home, you see," continued Budden, dusting his boots with a table napkin. "Ha, ha, ha! Upon my life, I'm hungry." Minns rang the bell and tried to smile. "I decidedly never was so hot in my life," continued Octavius, wiping his forehead. "Well, but how are you, Minns? 'Pon my soul, you wear capably." "Do you think so?" said Minns, and he tried another smile. "'Pon my life, I do." "Mrs. B. and what's his name, quite well?" "Alec, my son, you mean? Never better. But at such a place as we've got at Poplar Walk, you know, he couldn't be ill if he tried. When I first saw it, by Jove, it looked so knowing with the front garden and the green railings and the brass knocker and all that. I really thought it was a cut above." "Don't you think you'd like the ham better," interrupted Minns, "if you cut it the other way?" He saw, with feelings which it is impossible to describe, that his visitor was cutting, or rather maiming, the ham, in utter violation of all established rules. "No, thank ye," returned Budden, with the most barbarous indifference to crime. "I prefer it this way. It eats short.
But I say, Minns, when will you come down and see us? You will be delighted with the place. I know you will. Amelia and I were talking about you the other night, and Amelia said, 'Another lump of sugar, please, thank you.' She said, 'Don't you think you could contrive, my dear, to say to Mr. Minns in a friendly way, "Come down, sir"? Curse the dog. He's spoiling your curtains, Minns. Ha, 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 ha.'"
Minns leaped from his seat as though he had received the discharge from a galvanic battery.
"Come out, sir. Go out. Who?"
cried poor Augustus, keeping, nevertheless, at a very respectful distance from the dog. Having read of a case of hydrophobia in the paper of that morning, by dint of great exertion, much shouting, and a marvelous deal of poking under the tables with a stick and umbrella, the dog was at last dislodged and placed on the landing outside the door, where he immediately commenced a most appalling howling, at the same time vehemently scratching the paint off the two nicely varnished bottom panels, until they resembled the interior of a backgammon board.
"A good dog for the country, that,"
coolly observed Budden to the distracted Minns.
"But he's not much used to confinement. But now, Minns, when will you come down? I'll take no denial, positively. Let's see, today's Thursday. Will you come on Sunday? We dine at 5. Don't say no. Do."
After a great deal of pressing, Mr. Augustus Minns, driven to despair, accepted the invitation and promised to be at Poplar Walk on the ensuing Sunday at 5:15 to the minute.
"Now mind the direction," said Budden. "The coach goes from the Flower Pot in Bishopsgate Street every half hour. When the coach stops at the Swan, you'll see immediately opposite you a white house." "Which is your house, I understand,"
said Minns, wishing to cut short the visit and the story at the same time.
No, that's not mine. That's Grogus's, the great ironmonger's. I was going to say, you turn down by the side of the White House till you can't go another step further. Mind that. And then you turn to your right by some stables. Well, close to you, you'll see a wall with 'Beware of the Dog' written on it in large letters."
Minns shuddered.
"Go along by the side of that wall for about 1/4 of a mile, and anybody will show you which is my place."
"Very well. Thank ye. Goodbye."
"Be punctual." "Certainly. Good morning. I say, Minns, you've got a card?"
"Yes, I have. Thank ye." And Mr. Octavius Budden departed, leaving his cousin looking forward to his visit on the following Sunday with the feelings of a penniless poet to the weekly visit of his Scotch landlady. Sunday arrived. The sky was bright and clear. Crowds of people were hurrying along the streets, intent on their different schemes of pleasure for the day. Everything and everybody looked cheerful and happy, except Mr. Augustus Minns. The day was fine, but the heat was considerable. When Mr. Minns had fagged up the shady side of Fleet Street, Cheapside, and Threadneedle Street, he had become pretty warm, tolerably dusty, and it was getting late into the bargain. By the most extraordinary good fortune, however, a coach was waiting at the Flower Pot, into which Mr. Augustus Minns got, on the solemn assurance of the cad that the vehicle would start in 3 minutes, that being the very utmost extremity of time it was allowed to wait by Act of Parliament. 1/4 of an hour elapsed, and there was no signs of moving. Minns looked at his watch for the 6th time.
"Coachman, are you going or not?"
bawled Mr. Minns, with his head and half his body out of the coach window.
"Directly, sir," said the coachman,
with his hands in his pockets, looking as much unlike a man in a hurry as possible.
"Bill, take them cloths off."
5 minutes more elapsed, at the end of which time the coachman mounted the box, from whence he looked down the street and up the street, and hailed all the pedestrians for another 5 minutes.
"Coachman, if you don't go this moment, I shall get out," said Mr. Minns,
rendered desperate by the lateness of the hour and the impossibility of being in Poplar Walk at the appointed time.
"Going this minute, sir,"
was the reply, and accordingly the machine trundled on for a couple of 100 yards, and then stopped again. Minns doubled himself up in a corner of the coach and abandoned himself to his fate, as a child, a mother, a bandbox, and a parasol became his fellow passengers. The child was an affectionate and amiable infant. The little dear mistook Minns for his other parent, and screamed to embrace him. "Oh, be quiet, dear," said the mamma, restraining the impetuosity of the darling, whose little fat legs were kicking and stamping and twining themselves into the most complicated forms, in an ecstasy of impatience.
Be quiet, dear, that's not your papa. Thank heaven I am not, thought Minns, as the first gleam of pleasure he had experienced that morning shone like a meteor through his wretchedness. Playfulness was agreeably mingled with affection in the disposition of the boy. When satisfied that Mr. Minns was not his parent, he endeavored to attract his notice by scraping his drab trousers with his dirty shoes, poking his chest with his mamma's parasol, and other nameless endearments peculiar to infancy, which he beguiled the tediousness of the ride, apparently very much to his own satisfaction. When the unfortunate gentleman arrived at the Swan, he found to his great dismay that it was 5:15. The White House, the stables, the beware of the dog, every landmark was passed with a rapidity not unusual to a gentleman of a certain age when too late for dinner. After the lapse of a few minutes, Mr. Minns found himself opposite a yellow brick house with a green door, brass knocker, and door plate, green window frames and ditto railings with a garden in front. That is to say, a small loose bit of gravelled ground with one round and two scalene triangular beds containing a fir tree, 20 or 30 bulbs, and an unlimited number of marigolds. The taste of Mr. and Mrs. Budden was further displayed by the appearance of a cupid on each side of the door, perched upon a heap of large chalk flints, variegated with pink conch shells. His knock at the door was answered by a stumpy boy in drab livery, cotton stockings and high-lows, who, after hanging his hat on one of the dozen brass pegs which ornamented the passage, denominated by courtesy the hall, ushered him into a front drawing-room commanding a very extensive view of the backs of the neighboring houses. The usual ceremony of introduction and so forth over, Mr. Minns took his seat, not a little agitated at finding that he was the last comer and, somehow or other, the lion of about a dozen people, sitting together in a small drawing-room, getting rid of that most tedious of all time, the time preceding dinner. "Well, Brogson," said
Budden, addressing an elderly gentleman in a black coat, drab knee breeches, and long gaiters, who, under pretense of inspecting the prints in an annual, had been engaged in satisfying himself on the subject of Mr. Minns's general appearance, by looking at him over the tops of the leaves.
"Well, Brogson, what do ministers mean to do? Will they go out, or what?" "Oh, why, really, you know, I'm the last person in the world to ask for news. Your cousin, from his situation, is the most likely person to answer the question."
Mr. Minns assured the last speaker that, although he was in Somerset House, he possessed no official communication relative to the projects of His Majesty's ministers. But his remark was evidently received incredulously, and no further conjectures being hazarded on the subject, a long pause ensued, during which the company occupied themselves in coughing and blowing their noses, until the entrance of Mrs. Budden caused a general rise. The ceremony of introduction being over, dinner was announced, and downstairs the party proceeded accordingly. Mr. Minns escorting Mrs. Budden as far as the drawing-room door, but being prevented, by the narrowness of the staircase, from extending his gallantry any farther. The dinner passed off as such dinners usually do, ever and anon amidst the clatter of knives and forks, and the hum of conversation. Mr. B.'s voice might be heard, asking a friend to take wine, and assuring him he was glad to see him, and a great deal of by-play took place between Mrs. B. and the servants respecting the removal of the dishes, during which her countenance assumed all the variations of a weather-glass, from stormy to set fair. Upon the dessert and wine being placed on the table, the servant, in compliance with a significant look from Mrs. B., brought down Master Alexander, habited in a sky-blue suit with silver buttons, and possessing hair of nearly the same color as the metal. After sundry praises from his mother and various admonitions as to his behavior from his father, he was introduced to his godfather.
"Well, my little fellow, you are a fine boy, ain't you?"
said Mr. Minns, as happy as a tomtit on a birdlime.
"Yes." "How old are you?" 8 next Wednesday. How old are you?"
"Alexander," interrupted his mother, "how dare you ask Mr. Minns how old he is?"
"Well, he asked me how old I was,"
said the precocious child, to whom Minns had from that moment internally resolved that he never would bequeath 1 shilling. As soon as the titter occasioned by the observation had subsided, a little smirking man with red whiskers, sitting at the bottom of the table, who during the whole of dinner had been endeavoring to obtain a listener to some stories about Sheridan, called out with a very patronizing air, "Alec, what part of speech is be?" "A verb." "That's a good boy," said Mrs. Budden with all a mother's prize. "Now you know what a verb is." "A verb is a word which signifies to be, to do, or to suffer. As I am, I rule, I am ruled. Give me an apple, Ma." "I'll give you an apple," replied the man with the red whiskers, who was an established friend of the family, or, in other words, was always invited by Mrs. Budden, whether Mr. Budden liked it or not. "If you'll tell me what is the meaning of bee." "Bee," said the prodigy, after a little hesitation, "an insect that gathers honey." "No, dear," frowned Mrs. Budden, "B-double-E is the substantive." "I don't think he knows much yet about common substantives," said the smirking gentleman, who thought this an admirable opportunity for letting off a joke. "It's clear he's not very well acquainted with proper names. He, he, he." "Gentlemen," called out Mr. Budden from the end of the table in a stentorian voice, and with a very important air, "will you have the goodness to charge your glasses? I have a toast to propose." "Hear, hear!" cried the gentleman, passing the decanters. After they had made the round of the table, Mr. Budden proceeded, "Gentlemen, there is an individual present." "Hear, hear!" said the little man with red whiskers. "Pray be quiet, Jones," remonstrated Budden. "I say, gentlemen, there is an individual present," resumed the host, "in whose society I am sure we must take great delight, and the conversation of that individual must have afforded to everyone present the utmost pleasure." "Thank heaven he does not mean me," thought Minns, conscious that his diffidence and exclusiveness had prevented his saying above a dozen words since he entered the house. "Gentlemen, I am but a humble individual myself, and I perhaps ought to apologize for allowing any individual feeling of friendship and affection for the person I allude to induce me to venture to rise, to propose the health of that person, a person that I am sure, that is to say, a person whose virtues must endear him to those who know him, and those who have not the pleasure of knowing him cannot dislike him." "Hear, hear!" said the company, in a tone of encouragement and approval. "Gentlemen," continued Budden, "my cousin is a man who is a relation of my own." "Hear, hear!" Minns groaned audibly. "Who I am most happy to see here, and who, if he were not here, would certainly have deprived us of the great pleasure we all feel in seeing him." Loud cries of "Hear!" "Gentlemen, I feel that I have already trespassed on your attention for too long a time, with every sentiment of gratification," suggested the friend of the family. "Of gratification, I beg to propose the health of Mr. Minns." "Standing, gentlemen," shouted the indefatigable little man with the whiskers, "and with the honors. Take your time for me, if you please. Hip, 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 za! Hip, 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 za! Hip, hip, za!" All eyes were now fixed on the subject of the toast, who, by gulping down port wine at the imminent hazard of suffocation, endeavored to conceal his confusion. After as long a pause as decency would admit, he rose, but as the newspapers sometimes say in their reports, "We regret that we are quite unable to give even the substance of the honorable gentleman's observations." The words "present company," "honor," "present occasion," and "great happiness," heard occasionally and repeated at intervals with a countenance expressive of the utmost confusion and misery, convinced the company that he was making an excellent speech, and accordingly, on his resuming his seat, they cried "Bravo!" and manifested tumultuous applause. Jones, who had been long watching his opportunity, then darted up. "Budden," said he, "will you allow me to propose a toast?" "Certainly," replied Budden, adding in an undertone to Minns right across the table, "Devilish sharp fellow that. You'll be very much pleased with his speech. He talks equally well on any subject." Minns bowed, and Mr. Jones proceeded.
It has on several occasions, in various instances, under many circumstances, and in different companies, fallen to my lot to propose a toast to those by whom, at the time, I have had the honour to be surrounded. I have sometimes, I will cheerfully own, for why should I deny it, felt the overwhelming nature of the task I have undertaken, and my own utter incapability to do justice to the subject. If such have been my feelings, however, on former occasions, what must they be now? Now, under the extraordinary circumstances in which I am placed. Hear, hear! To describe my feelings accurately would be impossible, but I cannot give you a better idea of them, gentlemen, than by referring to a circumstance which happens, oddly enough, to occur to my mind at the moment. On one occasion, when that truly great and illustrious man Sheridan was...
Now there is no knowing what new villainy in the form of a joke would have been heaped on the grave of that very ill-used man, Mr. Sheridan, if the boy in drab had not at that moment entered the room in a breathless state to report that, as it was a very wet night, the 9 o'clock stage had come round, to know whether there was anybody going to town, as, in that case, he, the 9 o'clock, had room for one inside. Mr. Minns started up, and despite countless exclamations of surprise and entreaties to stay, persisted in his determination to accept the vacant place. But the brown silk umbrella was nowhere to be found, and as the coachman couldn't wait, he drove back to the Swan, leaving word for Mr. Minns to run round and catch him. However, as it did not occur to Mr. Minns for some 10 minutes or so that he had left the brown silk umbrella with the ivory handle in the other coach coming down, and moreover, as he was by no means remarkable for speed, it is no matter of surprise that when he accomplished the feat of running round to the Swan, the coach, the last coach, had gone without him. It was somewhere about 3 o'clock in the morning when Mr. Augustus Minns knocked feebly at the street door of his lodgings in Tavistock Street, cold, wet, cross, and miserable. He made his will next morning, and his professional man informs us, in that strict confidence in which we inform the public, that neither the name of Mr. Octavius Budden, nor of Mrs. Amelia Budden, nor of Master Alexander Augustus Budden appears therein. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's story, and I want to thank you for joining me at my bookshelves to enjoy Dickens's very first published story. I thought this one was hilarious. You can really see his humor and just even in just a few pages, the sharp characteristics that are contained in his stories. Mr. Minns is definitely a grump, and I was kind of appalled though to read the line about how he wouldn't baffle an eye at the execution of a dog or a child. Either one was the same to him. He wouldn't care. So yeah, this dude really hated hated children, and from the sounds of it, he disliked people. I love how he's describing when his cousin comes to visit him. It's this dreadful experience that he is facing. He doesn't want people visiting him. He's kind of a curmudgeon, possibly an introvert. He just wants to be left alone, and there are days where I can identify with that. I hope you enjoyed that story. I look forward to reading another one to you next month. So thank you for watching today's episode of Victorian Shorts. And until next time, happy reading. Take care.